The Lost World by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 4. It's just the very biggest thing in the world. Professor Challenger and I re-entered the room which we had left so tumultuously 10 minutes before. The professor closed the door carefully behind us and motioned me into an armchair. "First of all, as to your return to my house after your well-merited expulsion, the reason lay in your answer to that most officious policeman, in which I seem to discern some glimmering of good feeling upon your part, more at any rate than I am accustomed to associate with your profession. In admitting that the fault of the incident lay with you, you gave some evidence of a certain mental detachment and breadth of view which attracted my favourable notice. For this reason I ask you to return with me, as I was minded to make your further acquaintance." All this he boomed forth from behind his desk like a professor addressing his class. Now he suddenly turned himself sideways, and all I could see of him was tangled hair with a red protruding ear. He was scratching about among the litter of papers upon his desk. He faced me presently, with what looked like a very tattered sketch-book in his hand. "I am going to talk to you about South America," said he. "No comments, if you please. First of all, I wish you to understand that nothing I tell you now is to be repeated in any public way, unless you have been given my express permission. That permission will, in all human probability, never be given. Is that clear?" "It is very hard," said I. "Surely a judicious account—" He replaced the notebook upon the table. "That ends it," said he. "I wish you a very good morning." "No, no," I cried. "I submit to any conditions. So far as I can see, I have no choice." "None in the world," said he. "Well then, I promise." "So, you have given me your promise that my confidence will be respected. That confidence, I may say, will be far from complete. But I am prepared to give you a few indications which will be of interest. In the first place, you are probably aware that 2 years ago I made a journey to South America. The object of my journey was to verify some conclusions of Wallace and of Bates, but a curious incident occurred to me while there, which opened up an entirely fresh line of inquiry. You are aware, or probably in this half-educated age you are not aware, that the country round some parts of the Amazon are still only partially explored. It was my business to visit this little-known back country and to examine its fauna. I was returning, my work accomplished, when I had occasion to spend a night at a small village, a settlement of the Kucama Indians, an amiable but degraded race, with mental powers hardly superior to that of the average Londoner. I had effected some cures among them upon my way up the river, and found myself eagerly awaited upon my return. I gathered that someone had urgent need of my medical services, and I followed the chief to one of his huts. When I entered, I found that the sufferer had that instant expired. He was, to my surprise, a white man, almost albino. As far as I could understand the account of the natives, he was a complete stranger to them, and had come upon their village through the woods alone and in the last stage of exhaustion. The man's knapsack lay beside the couch, and I examined the contents. His name was written upon a tab within it, Maplewhite, Lake Avenue, Detroit, Michigan. From the contents of the knapsack it was evident that this man had been an artist and poet in search of effects. There were scraps of verse, singularly wanting in merit, some rather commonplace pictures of river scenery, a paint-box, a box of coloured chalks, some brushes, that curved bone which lies upon my inkstand, a volume of Baxter's Moth and Butterflies, a cheap revolver, and a few cartridges. Of personal equipment he had either none, or he had lost it in his journey. I was turning away from him when I observed that something projected from the front of his ragged jacket. It was this sketch-book, which was as dilapidated then as you see it now. Indeed, I can assure you that a first folio of Shakespeare could not be treated with greater reverence than this relic has been since it came into my possession. I hand it to you now, and I ask you to take it page by page, and to examine the contents." I had opened the volume with some expectation of a revelation, though of what nature I could not imagine. The first page was disappointing, however, as it contained nothing but the picture of a very fat man in a pea jacket. There followed several pages filled with small sketches of Indians and their ways. Then came a picture of a cheerful and corpulent ecclesiastic in a shovel hat, followed by studies of women and babies, accounting for several more pages, and then an unbroken series of animals. Finally came a double page of studies of long-snouted and very unpleasant saurians. I could make nothing of it, and said so to the professor. Surely those are only crocodiles. Alligators! Alligators! There is hardly such a thing as a true crocodile in South America. The distinction between them, I meant to say, I could see nothing unusual, nothing to justify what you have said. He smiled serenely. Try the next page, said he. I was still unable to sympathize. It was a full-page sketch of a landscape, roughly tinted in colour. There was a pale green foreground of feathery vegetation which sloped upwards and ended in a line of cliffs, dark red in colour, and curiously ribbed, extending in an unbroken wall right across the background. At one point was an isolated pyramidal rock, crowned by a great tree, which appeared to be separated by a cleft from the main crag. Behind it all, a blue tropical sky. A thin green line of vegetation fringed the summit of the ruddy cliff. Well? He asked. It is no doubt a curious formation, said I, but I am not geologist enough to say that it is wonderful. Wonderful, he repeated. It is unique. It is incredible. No one on earth has ever dreamed of such a possibility. Now to the next. I turned it over and gave an exclamation of surprise. There was a full-page picture of the most extraordinary creature that I had ever seen. It was the wild dream of an opium smoker, a vision of delirium. The head was like that of a fowl, the body that of a bloated lizard. The trailing tail was furnished with upward-turned spikes, and the curved back was edged with a high, serrated fringe. In front of this creature was an absurd mannequin, or dwarf, in human form, who stood staring at it. Well, what do you think of that? Cried the professor, rubbing his hands with an air of triumph. It is monstrous, grotesque. But what made him draw such an animal? Trade gin, I should think. Ah, that's the best explanation you can give, is it? Well, sir, what is yours? The obvious one, that the creature exists. That is actually sketched from the life. I should have laughed, only I had a vision of our doing another Catherine wheel down the passage. No doubt, said I, no doubt, as one humours an imbecile. I confess, however, I added, that this tiny human figure puzzles me. If it were an Indian, we could set it down as evidence of some pygmy race in America, but it appears to be a European in a sun hat. The professor snorted like an angry buffalo. You really touch the limit, said he. Look here, he cried, leaning forward and dabbing a great hairy sausage of a finger onto the picture. You see that plant behind the animal? It is a vegetable ivory palm, and they run to about 50 or 60 feet. Don't you see that the man is put in for a purpose? He couldn't really have stood in front of that brute and lived to draw it. He sketched himself in to give a scale of heights. Good heavens, I cried. Then you think the beast was... Why, Charing Cross Station would hardly make a kennel for such a brute. But, said I, surely the whole experience of the human race is not to be set aside on account of a single sketch. I had turned over the leaves and ascertained that there was nothing more in the book. A single sketch by a wandering American artist who may have done it simply in order to gratify a freakish imagination. You can't, as a man of science, defend such a position as that. For answer, the professor took a book down from a shelf. This is an excellent monograph by my gifted friend Ray Lancaster, said he. There is an illustration here which would interest you. Ah, yes, here it is. The inscription beneath it runs, Probable appearance in life of the Jurassic dinosaur Stegosaurus. Well, what do you make of it? He handed me the open book. I started as I looked at the picture. In this reconstructed animal of a dead world, there was certainly a very great resemblance to the sketch of the unknown artist. That is certainly remarkable, said I. But you won't admit that it is final. Surely it might be a coincidence, or this American may have seen a picture of the kind and carried it in his memory. Very good, said the professor indulgently. We shall leave it at that. I will now ask you to look at this bone. He handed over the one which he had already described as part of the dead man's possessions. It was about 6 inches long and thicker than my thumb, with some indications of dried cartilage at one end. "To what known creature does this bone belong?" asked the professor. "I must confess that I don't know." "You need not be ashamed to expose your ignorance, for I don't suppose the whole Kensington staff could give it a name. But you may take it, young man, that I am versed in the elements of my business. This is not a conceivable bone of any creature known to zoology. It belongs to a very large, a very strong, and by all analogy a very fierce animal, which exists upon the face of the earth, but has not yet come under the notice of science. You are still unconvinced?" "I am at least deeply interested." "Then your case is not hopeless. You can imagine that I could hardly come away from the Amazon without probing deeper into the matter. There were indications as to the direction from which the dead traveller had come. Indian legends alone would have been my guide, for I found that rumours of a strange land were common among all the riverine tribes. You have heard, no doubt, of Kurupuri? Never. Kurupuri is the spirit of the woods, something terrible, something malevolent, something to be avoided. None can describe its shape or nature, but it is a word of terror along the Amazon. Now all tribes agree as to the direction in which Kurupuri lives. It was the same direction from which the American had come. Something terrible lay that way. It was my business to find out what it was." "What did you do?" My flippancy was all gone. This massive man compelled one's attention and respect. "I overcame the extreme reluctance of the natives and got 2 of them to act as guides. After many adventures which I need not describe, and after travelling a distance which I will not mention, in a direction which I withhold, we came at last to a tract of country which has never been described, nor indeed visited, save by my unfortunate predecessor. Would you kindly look at this?" He handed me a photograph, half plate size. "The unsatisfactory appearance of it is due to the fact," said he, "that on descending the river the boat was upset, and the case which contained the undeveloped films was broken with disastrous results. Nearly all of them were totally ruined, an irreparable loss. This is one of the few which partially escaped. This explanation of deficiencies or abnormalities you will kindly accept. There was talk of faking. I am not in a mood to argue such a point." The photograph was certainly very off-coloured, but I gradually deciphered the details of it. I realized that it represented a long and enormous high line of cliffs, exactly like an immense cataract seen in the distance, with a sloping, tree-clad plain in the foreground. "I believe it is the same place as the painted picture," said I. "It is the same place," the professor answered. "I found traces of the fellow's camp. Now, look at this." It was a nearer view of the same scene, though the photograph was extremely defective. I could distinctly see the isolated tree-crowned pinnacle of rock which was detached from the crag. "I have no doubt of it at all," said I. "Well, that is something gained," said he. "We progress, do we not? Now, will you please look at the top of that rocky pinnacle? Do you observe something there?" "An enormous tree? But on the tree?" "A large bird," said I. He handed me a lens. "Yes," I said, peering through it, "a large bird stands upon the tree. It appears to have a considerable beak. I should say it was a pelican." "I cannot congratulate you upon your eyesight," said the professor. "It is not a pelican, nor indeed is it a bird. It may interest you to know that I succeeded in shooting that particular specimen. It was the only absolute proof of my experiences which I was able to bring away with me." "You have it, then?" Here at last was tangible corroboration. I had it. It was unfortunately lost with so much else in the same boat accident which ruined my photographs. I clutched at it as it disappeared in the swirl of the rapids, and part of its wing was left in my hand. I was insensible when washed ashore, but the miserable remnant of my superb specimen was still intact. I now lay it before you." From a drawer he produced what seemed to me to be the upper portion of the wing of a large bat. It was at least 2 feet in length, a curved bone with a membranous veil beneath it. "A monstrous bat," I suggested. "Nothing of the sort," said the professor severely. He opened the standard work to which he had already referred me. "Here," said he, pointing to the picture of an extraordinary flying monster, "is an excellent reproduction of the pterodactyl, a flying reptile of the Jurassic period. On the next page is a diagram of the mechanism of its wing. Kindly compare it with the specimen in your hand." A wave of amazement passed over me as I looked. I was convinced. There could be no getting away from it. The cumulative proof was overwhelming. The sketch, the photographs, the narrative, and now the actual specimen. The evidence was complete. I said so warmly, for I felt that the professor was an ill-used man. He leaned back in his chair with drooping eyelids and a tolerant smile, basking in this sudden gleam of sunshine. "It is just the very biggest thing I ever heard of," said I, though it was my journalistic rather than my scientific enthusiasm that was roused. "It is colossal. You are a Columbus of science who has discovered a lost world. I'm awfully sorry if I seem to doubt you. It was all so unthinkable, but I understand evidence when I see it, and this should be good enough for anyone." The professor purred with satisfaction. "And then, sir, what did you do next?" "It was the wet season, Mr. Malone, and my stores were exhausted. I explored some portion of this huge cliff, but I was unable to find any way to scale it. The pyramidal rock upon which I saw and shot the pterodactyl was more accessible. Being something of a cragsman, I did manage to get halfway to the top of that. From that height I had a better idea of the plateau upon the top of the crags. It appeared to be very large. Neither to east nor to west could I see an end to the vista of green-capped cliffs. Below it is a swampy, jungly region full of snakes, insects, and fever. It is a natural protection to this singular country." "Did you see any other trace of life?" "No, sir, I did not. But during the week that we lay encamped at the base of the cliff, we heard some very strange noises from above." "But the creature that the American drew, how do you account for that?" "We can only suppose that he must have made his way to the summit and seen it there. We know, therefore, that there is a way up. We know equally that it must be a very difficult one, otherwise the creatures would have come down and overrun the surrounding country. Surely that is clear." "But how did they come to be there?" "I do not think that the problem is a very obscure one," said the professor. "There can only be one explanation. At this single point in the interior there has been in some far distant age a great sudden volcanic upheaval. An area as large perhaps as Sussex has been lifted up en bloc with all its living contents and cut off from all the rest of the continent. What is the result? Why, the ordinary laws of nature are suspended. Creatures survive which would otherwise disappear. You will observe that both the pterodactyl and the stegosaurus are Jurassic, and therefore of a great age in the order of life. They have been artificially conserved by those strange accidental conditions." "But surely your evidence is conclusive. You have only to lay it before the proper authorities." "So, in my simplicity, I had imagined," said the professor bitterly. "I can only tell you that it was not so, that I was met at every turn by incredulity, born partly of stupidity and partly of jealousy. It is not my nature, sir, to cringe to any man, or to seek to prove a fact if my word has been doubted. By nature I am, I admit, somewhat fiery, and under provocation I am inclined to be violent. I fear you may have remarked it." I nursed my eye and was silent. "Tonight, however, I propose to give an extreme example of the control of the will over the emotions. I invite you to be present at the exhibition." He handed me a card from his desk. "You will perceive that Mr. Percival Waldron, a naturalist of some popular repute, is announced to lecture at 8:30 at the Zoological Institute's Hall upon the record of the ages. I have been specially invited to be present upon the platform and to move a vote of thanks to the lecturer. While doing so, I shall make it my business, with infinite tact and delicacy, to throw out a few remarks which may arouse the interest of the audience and cause some of them to desire to go more deeply into the matter. Nothing contentious, you understand, but only an indication that there are greater deeps beyond. I shall hold myself strongly in leash, and see whether by this self-restraint I attain a more favourable result." "And may I come?" I asked eagerly. "Well, surely," he answered cordially. He had an enormously massive, genial manner, which was almost as overpowering in his violence. "It will be a comfort to me to know that I have one ally in the hall, however inefficient and ignorant of the subject he may be. I fancy there will be a large audience, for Waldron, although an absolute charlatan, has a considerable popular following. I shall be pleased to see you at the lecture tonight, Mr. Malone. In the meantime, you will understand that no public use is to be made of any of the material that I have given you." "But Mr. McArdle, my news editor, you know, will want to know what I have done." "Tell him what you like. You can say, among other things, that if he sends anyone else to intrude upon me, I shall call upon him with a riding whip. But I leave it to you that nothing of all this appears in print." "Very good. Then the Zoological Institute Hall at 8:30 tonight." I had a last impression of red cheeks, rippling beard, and intolerant eyes as he waved me out of the room. Chapter 5. Question. A taxicab was waiting at the end of the road, so I sprang into it and drove down to the office. McArdle was at his post as usual. "Well," he cried expectantly, "what may I run to? I'm thinking, young man, you've been in the wars. Don't tell me that he assaulted you." We had a little difference at first. "What a man it is! What did you do?" "Well, he became more reasonable and we had a chat, but I got nothing out of him. Nothing for publication." "I'm not so sure about that. You've got a black eye out of him, and that's for publication. We must bring the man to his bearings. I'll have a leaderette on him tomorrow that will brand the fellow forever. I'll show him up for the fraud he is." "I wouldn't do that, sir." "Why not?" "Because he's not a fraud at all." "What?" roared McArdle. "You mean to say you really believe this stuff of his? Then for heaven's sake, man, write it up." "I'm longing to, but all I know he gave me in confidence, and on condition that I didn't." I condensed into a few sentences the professor's narrative. "That's how it stands." McArdle looked deeply incredulous. "Well, Mr. Malone," he said at last, "about this scientific meeting tonight, there can be no privacy about that, anyhow. I don't suppose any paper will want to report it, for no one is aware that Challenger will speak. We may get a scoop if we are lucky. You'll be there in any case, so you'll give us a pretty full report. I'll keep space up to midnight." My day was a busy one, and I had an early dinner at the Savage Club with Tarp Henry, to whom I gave some account of my adventures. He listened with a sceptical smile on his gaunt face, and roared with laughter on hearing that the professor had convinced me. "My dear chap, things don't happen like that in real life. People don't stumble upon enormous discoveries and then lose their evidence. Leave that to the novelists. The fellow is as full of tricks as the monkey house at the zoo. It's all bosh. But the American poet, he never existed. I saw his sketchbook, Challenger's sketchbook. You think he drew that animal? Of course he did. Who else? Well, then the photographs. There was nothing in the photographs. By your own admission, you only saw a bird, a pterodactyl. That's what he says. He put the pterodactyl into your head. Well, then the bones. First one out of an Irish stew, second one vamped up for the occasion. If you are clever and you know your business, you can fake a bone as easily as you can fake a photograph." I began to feel uneasy. Perhaps, after all, I had been premature in my acquiescence. Then I had a sudden happy thought. "Will you come to the meeting?" I asked. Tarp Henry looked thoughtful. "He's not a popular person, the genial Challenger," said he. "A lot of people have accounts to settle with him. I should say he is about the best hated man in London. If the medical students turn out, there will be no end of a rag. I don't want to get into a beer garden." "You might at least do him the justice to hear him state his own case." "Well, perhaps it is only fair. All right, I'm the man for your evening." When we arrived at the hall, we found a much greater concourse than I had expected. A line of taxis discharged their little cargoes of white-bearded professors, while the dark stream of humbler pedestrians who crowded through the arched doorway showed that the audience would be popular as well as scientific. Indeed, it became evident to us as soon as we had taken our seats that a youthful and even boyish spirit was abroad in the gallery and the back portions of the hall. When Professor Challenger eventually passed down to take his place at the extreme end of the front row of the platform, such a yell of welcome broke forth as his black beard first protruded round the corner, that I began to suspect Tarp Henry was right in his surmise, and that this assemblage was there not merely for the sake of the lecture, but because it had got rumoured abroad that the famous professor would take part in the proceedings. Challenger smiled with a weary and tolerant contempt, as a kindly man would meet the yapping of a litter of puppies. He sat slowly down, blew out his chest, passed his hand caressingly down his beard, and looked with drooping eyelids and supercilious eyes at the crowded hall before him. The uproar of his advent had not yet died away when Professor Ronald Murray, the chairman, and Mr. Waldron, the lecturer, threaded their way to the front, and the proceedings began. Professor Murray will, I am sure, excuse me if I say that he has the common fault of most Englishmen of being inaudible. He made several profound remarks to his white tie and to the water carafe upon the table, with a humorous twinkling aside to the silver candlestick upon his right. Then he sat down, and Mr. Waldron, the famous popular lecturer, rose amid a general murmur of applause. He was a stern, gaunt man with a harsh voice and an aggressive manner, but he had the merit of knowing how to assimilate the ideas of other men and to pass them on in a way which was intelligible and even interesting to the lay public, with a happy knack of being funny about the most unlikely objects, so that the procession of the equinox or the formation of a vertebrate became a highly humorous process as treated by him. It was a bird's-eye view of creation, as interpreted by science, which, in language always clear and sometimes picturesque, he unfolded before us. He told us of the globe, a huge mass of flaming gas flaring through the heavens. Then he pictured the solidification, the cooling, the wrinkling which formed the mountains, the steam which turned to water, the slow preparation of the stage upon which was to be played the inexplicable drama of life, the drying of the seas, the emergence of the sandbank, the sluggish, viscous life which lay upon their margins, the overcrowded lagoons, the tendency of the sea creatures to take refuge upon the mudflats, the abundance of food awaiting them, and their consequent enormous growth. Hence, ladies and gentlemen, he added, that frightful breed of saurians which still affront our eyes when seen in the Wealden or in the Sollenhofen slates, but which were fortunately extinct long before the first appearance of mankind upon this planet. Question, boomed a voice from the platform. Mr. Waldron was a strict disciplinarian with a gift of acid humour, which made it perilous to interrupt him. But this interjection appeared to him so absurd that he was at a loss as to how to deal with it. He paused for a moment, and then, raising his voice, repeated slowly the words, "which were extinct before the coming of man." Question, boomed the voice once more. Waldron looked with amazement along the line of professors upon the platform until his eyes fell upon the figure of Challenger, who leaned back in his chair with eyes closed and an amused expression, as if he were smiling in his sleep. "I see," said Waldron, with a shrug. "It is my friend Professor Challenger," and amid laughter he renewed his lecture as if this was a final explanation and no more need be said. But the incident was far from being closed. Whatever path the lecturer took amid the wilds of the past seemed invariably to lead him to some assertion as to extinct or prehistoric life, which instantly brought the same bull's bellow from the professor. Waldron, though a hardened lecturer and a strong man, became rattled, and finally turned furiously upon the cause of his troubles. "This is really intolerable," he cried, glaring across the platform. "I must ask you, Professor Challenger, to cease these ignorant and unmannerly interruptions." There was a hush over the hall, the students rigid with delight at seeing the high gods on Olympus quarrelling among themselves. Challenger levered his bulky figure slowly out of his chair. "And I must in turn ask you, Mr. Waldron," he said, "to cease to make assertions which are not in strict accordance with scientific fact." The words unloosed a tempest. "Shame, shame! Give him a hearing! Put him out! Shove him off the platform! Fair play!" emerged from the general roar of amusement or execration. The chairman was on his feet, flapping both his hands and bleating excitedly. "Professor Challenger! Personal views! Later!" were the solid peaks above his clouds of inaudible mutter. The interrupter bowed, smiled, stroking his beard, and relapsed into his chair. Waldron, very flushed and warlike, continued his observations. Now and then, as he made an assertion, he shot a venomous glance at his opponent, who seemed to be slumbering deeply with the same broad, happy smile upon his face. At last the lecture came to an end. I'm inclined to think that it was a premature one. Professor Challenger rose and advanced to the edge of the platform. In the interests of my paper, I took down his speech verbatim. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I have been selected to move a vote of thanks to Mr. Waldron for the very picturesque and imaginative address to which you have just listened. There are points in it with which I disagree, and it has been my duty to indicate them as they arose. But nonetheless, Mr. Waldron has accomplished his object well, that object being to give a simple and interesting account of what he conceives to have been the history of our planet. But what is the particular point upon which I, as an original investigator, have challenged our lecturer's accuracy? It is upon the permanence of certain types of animal upon the earth. I do not speak upon this subject as an amateur, but as one whose scientific conscience compels him to adhere closely to facts, when I say that Mr. Waldron is very wrong in supposing that because he has never himself seen a so-called prehistoric animal, therefore these creatures no longer exist. They are indeed, as he has said, our ancestors, but they are, if I may use the expression, our contemporary ancestors, who can still be found with all their hideous and formidable characteristics if one has but the energy and hardihood to seek their haunts. Creatures which were supposed to be Jurassic monsters who would hunt down and devour our largest and fiercest mammals still exist. How do I know, you ask me? I know because I have visited their secret haunts. I know because I have seen one of them. If any person in this hall dares to doubt my veracity, I shall be glad to have a few words with him after the lecture. Every great discoverer has been met with the same incredulity, the sure brand of a generation of fools. When great facts are laid before you, you have not the intuition, the imagination which would help you to understand them. You can only throw mud at the men who have risked their lives to open new fields of science. You persecute the prophets, Galileo, Darwin, and I. All this is from my hurried notes taken at the time, which give little notion of the absolute chaos to which the assembly had by this time been reduced. So terrific was the uproar that several ladies had already beaten a hurried retreat. Grave and reverend seniors seemed to have caught the prevailing spirit as badly as the students, and I saw the white-bearded men rising and shaking their fists at the obdurate professor. The whole great audience seethed and simmered like a boiling pot. The professor took a step forward and raised both his hands. There was something so big and arresting and virile in the man that the clatter and shouting died gradually away before his commanding gesture and his masterful eye. He seemed to have a definite message. They hushed to hear it. "I will not detain you," he said. "It is not worth it. I claim that I have opened a new field of science. You dispute it? Then I put you to the test. Or will you accredit one or more of your number to go out as your representatives and test my statement in your name?" Mr. Summerlee, the veteran professor of comparative anatomy, rose among the audience, a tall, thin, bitter man with the withered aspect of a theologian. He wished, he said, to ask Professor Challenger whether the results to which he had alluded in his remarks had been obtained during a journey to the headwaters of the Amazon made by him 2 years before. Professor Challenger answered that they had. Mr. Summerlee desired to know how it was that Professor Challenger claimed to have made discoveries in this region, which had been overlooked by Wallace and Bates and other previous explorers of established scientific repute. Professor Challenger answered that Mr. Summerlee appeared to be confusing the Amazon with the Thames, that it was in reality a somewhat larger river that opened up so vast a space that it was not impossible for one person to find what another had missed. Mr. Summerlee declared with an acid smile that he fully appreciated the difference between the Thames and the Amazon, which lay in the fact that any assertion about the former could be tested, while about the latter it could not. He would be obliged if Professor Challenger would give the latitude and the longitude of the country in which prehistoric animals were to be found. Professor Challenger replied that he reserved such information for good reasons of his own, but would be prepared to give it, with proper precautions, to a committee chosen from the audience. Would Mr. Summerlee serve on such a committee and test his story in person? Mr. Summerlee declared that he would. "Then I guarantee," pronounced Professor Challenger, "that I will place in your hands such material as will enable you to find your way. It is only right, however, since Mr. Summerlee goes to check my statement, that I should have one or more with him who may check his. I will not disguise from you that there are difficulties and dangers, Mr. Summerlee. You will need a younger colleague. May I ask for volunteers?" It is thus that the great crisis of a man's life springs out at him. Could I have imagined when I entered that hall that I was about to pledge myself to a wilder adventure than had ever come to me in my dreams? But Gladys, was it not the very opportunity of which she spoke? I had sprung to my feet. I was speaking, and yet I had prepared no words. Tarp Henry, my sole companion, was plucking at my skirts, and I heard him whispering, "Sit down, Malone. Don't make an ass of yourself." At the same time I was aware that a tall, thin man, with dark, gingery hair a few seats in front of me, was also upon his feet. He glared back at me with hard, angry eyes, but I refused to give way. "I will go, Mr. Chairman," I kept repeating over and over again. "Name! Name!" cried the audience. "My name is Edward Dunn Malone. I am the reporter of the Daily Gazette. I claim to be an absolutely unprejudiced witness." "What is your name, sir?" the chairman asked of my tall rival. "I am Lord John Roxton. I have already been up the Amazon. I know all the ground and have special qualifications for this investigation. Lord John Roxton's reputation as a sportsman and traveller is, of course, world famous," said the chairman. "At the same time, it would certainly be as well to have a member of the press upon such an expedition." "Then I move," said Professor Challenger, "that both these gentlemen be elected as representatives of this meeting to accompany Professor Summerlee upon his journey to investigate and to report upon the truth of my statements." And so, amid shouting and cheering, our fate was decided, and I found myself borne away in the human current which swirled towards the door, with my mind half stunned by the vast new project which had risen so suddenly before it. As I emerged from the hall, I found myself walking under the silvery lights of Regent Street, full of thoughts of Gladys and of wonder as to my future. Suddenly there was a touch at my elbow. I turned and found myself looking into the humorous, masterful eyes of the tall, thin man who had volunteered to be my companion on this strange quest. "Mr. Malone, I understand. We are to be companions, what? My rooms are just over the road in the Albany. Perhaps you would have the kindness to spare me half an hour, for there are one or two things that I badly want to say to you."